The yellow school bus pulled away from Lincoln Elementary School, leaving behind a cloud of diesel smoke and the sound of excited children's voices fading into the distance. But one small figure remained standing on the sidewalk, clutching a worn backpack against her chest like a shield. Keiko Tanaka was 12 years old, though she looked younger with her petite frame and the way she seemed to shrink into herself. Her long black hair was neatly braided, just as her grandmother had taught her back in Japan. Everything about her morning routine was the same as it had been in Osaka, except now she was standing in front of a brick building in Ohio, thousands of miles away from everything familiar. She took a deep breath and walked through the glass doors of Lincoln Elementary. The hallways buzzed with energy as students rushed to their lockers, shouting to friends and laughing at jokes she couldn't understand. The fluorescent lights felt harsh compared to the soft morning light streaming through the windows of her old school in Japan. At her previous school, she had known every face, every corner, every rule. Here, everything was different. The lockers were painted bright blue instead of the natural wood she was used to. Students wore sneakers that squeaked against the polished floors. And the noise, so much noise. In Japan, her classrooms had been quiet, orderly places where students spoke only when asked. "You must be our new student," said a voice behind her. Keiko turned to see a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Mrs. Rodriguez, the school counselor. Let me show you to your classroom." As they walked down the hallway, Mrs. Rodriguez pointed out important places: the library, the cafeteria, the principal's office. Keiko nodded politely at each landmark, though her mind was racing with worry. Would she understand her teachers? Would the other children be nice to her? Her father had assured her that American schools were welcoming, but everything felt so overwhelming. They stopped in front of a door marked Room 15, Ms. Johnson. Through the small window, Keiko could see children already seated at their desks, chatting quietly as they waited for class to begin. Mrs. Rodriguez knocked gently and opened the door. "Good morning, class," said Ms. Johnson, a young woman with curly brown hair and a warm smile. "We have a very special new student joining us today. This is Keiko, and she's come all the way from Japan to be part of our classroom family." 22 pairs of curious eyes turned toward Keiko. Some children smiled, others stared, and a few whispered to their neighbors. Keiko felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. In Japan, she would have bowed respectfully to show her gratitude for being welcomed. It was what her parents had taught her, what her grandmother had always done when meeting new people. Without thinking, Keiko stepped forward and bent at the waist in a proper bow, just as she had done hundreds of times before. The room fell silent for a moment. Then she heard it, the sound that would echo in her ears for weeks to come. Giggles. Quiet at first, then spreading like ripples across a pond until several students were covering their mouths, trying not to laugh out loud. "Oh my," said Ms. Johnson quickly, her voice gentle but slightly flustered. "That's very polite, Keiko, but here in America we usually just wave hello or shake hands." Keiko's face turned even redder as she straightened up. She wanted to disappear, to somehow melt into the floor and never be seen again. In Japan, her bow had been a sign of respect and good manners. Here it had made her the center of unwanted attention. Ms. Johnson guided her to an empty desk near the window. As Keiko sat down, she could still hear whispers from the students around her. She understood enough English to catch fragments. Weird. Different. Why did she do that? The morning passed in a blur of confusion. During math class, Keiko discovered that American students worked problems differently than she had learned. When Ms. Johnson called on her to answer a question, Keiko's response was correct, but her accent made some students exchange glances. During reading time, she struggled with expressions and phrases that didn't exist in the English she had studied in Japan. But it was during lunch that Keiko felt most alone. She sat at the edge of a table, carefully unwrapping the bento box her mother had prepared. Inside were neat compartments filled with rice, vegetables, and small pieces of grilled fish. Comfort food from home. Around her, other children ate sandwiches, pizza, and snacks from colorful packages. "What is that?" asked a girl with red pigtails, pointing at Keiko's lunch. "It's rice and fish," Keiko replied softly, her words careful and measured. "It looks weird," the girl said, wrinkling her nose. "Why don't you eat normal food like peanut butter sandwiches?" Other children began to gather around, curious about the unusual lunch. Some seemed genuinely interested, asking questions about the different foods, but others made faces or commented about how strange everything looked. Keiko wanted to explain that this food was normal for her, that it was delicious and made with love by her mother. But the words felt stuck in her throat. The afternoon brought new challenges. In social studies, the teacher talked about American history and traditions that were completely foreign to Keiko. When students were asked to share about their own family traditions, Keiko hesitated. Should she tell them about cherry blossom festivals? About the way her family honored their ancestors? About the beautiful tea ceremony her grandmother had taught her? Instead, she remained quiet, afraid that anything she shared would seem as weird as her lunchtime beau had been. The final class of the day was music, held in a bright room filled with instruments and posters of famous composers. Mrs. Henderson, the music teacher, was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had been teaching at Lincoln Elementary for 25 years and had very specific ideas about how things should be done. Today we're going to talk about different types of music from around the world, Mrs. Henderson announced. Can anyone tell me about music from their family's heritage? Several hands shot up. Children talked about Irish fiddle music, Mexican folk songs, and African American spirituals. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly at each response, writing different countries and musical styles on the blackboard. Keiko's heart began to race. She knew so much about Japanese music, the delicate sounds of the koto, the powerful rhythms of taiko drums, the haunting melodies played on bamboo flutes. Her grandmother had filled her childhood with stories about traditional Japanese musicians and the importance of music in their culture. Slowly, Keiko raised her hand. Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. Yes, Keiko. In Japan, Keiko began, her voice barely above a whisper. We have many beautiful music. My grandmother, she teach me about... She paused, searching for the right English words. About old songs, very old, from long time ago. Mrs. Henderson's expression was polite but impatient. That's nice, dear. But let's focus on music that we can actually understand and relate to here in America. The words hit Keiko like a physical blow. She slowly lowered her hand, her eyes fixed on her desk. Around her, she could sense other students shifting uncomfortably, though whether they felt sorry for her or simply wanted to move on, she couldn't tell. As the school bell rang and students began packing up their belongings, Keiko sat quietly at her desk. The first day at her new school was ending, but it felt like the beginning of a very long and difficult journey. She walked slowly to the school bus, the weight of the day pressing down on her small shoulders. Through the window, she watched the American landscape roll by, so different from the mountains and temples of her homeland. Tonight, she would tell her parents that school was fine, because she knew they were worried enough already about their big move to America. But deep inside, Keiko felt more alone than ever, carrying a secret that no one at Lincoln Elementary could possibly imagine. 3 weeks had passed since Keiko's first day at Lincoln Elementary, and while she had learned to navigate the hallways and understand most of her teachers, she still felt like an outsider looking in. She had made a few acquaintances, but no real friends. During recess, she often sat alone on a bench, watching other children play games she didn't know how to join. The one place where Keiko felt most uncomfortable was Mrs. Henderson's music class. The teacher seemed to have little patience for anyone who didn't immediately understand her instructions, or who asked questions in accented English. Keiko had stopped raising her hand entirely, even when she knew the answers. On this particular Tuesday morning, the autumn air was crisp and colorful leaves danced outside the classroom windows. Mrs. Henderson stood at the front of the room with an unusual excitement in her voice. Class, I have wonderful news, she announced, clapping her hands together to get everyone's attention. Principal Williams has approved our annual talent showcase for next month. This is your chance to shine and show our school community what amazing talents you have. The room erupted with excited chatter. Students immediately began discussing what they might perform, singing, dancing, magic tricks, or playing instruments. Keiko listened quietly, her heart beginning to race for reasons she couldn't quite name. Mrs. Henderson continued, Anyone who wants to participate needs to audition first. We only have room for 12 acts, so you'll need to really impress me. I'll be holding tryouts next week during lunch periods. As the bell rang and students filed out of the music room, Keiko found herself walking slower than usual. An idea was forming in her mind, something that both excited and terrified her. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt a spark of hope. The rest of the day dragged by. During math class, she found herself thinking about melodies instead of multiplication tables. In science, while her teacher explained the water cycle, Keiko's fingers unconsciously moved as if they were dancing across piano keys. That evening at dinner, her parents noticed she seemed different. "How was school today, sweetheart?" asked her mother, serving rice into Keiko's bowl. "There's going to be a talent show," Keiko said quietly, not meeting their eyes. Her father looked up from his newspaper. "That sounds interesting. Are you thinking about participating?" Keiko nodded slowly. "Maybe I could play piano?" Her parents exchanged glances. They knew how much music meant to their daughter, how it had been her refuge during the difficult transition to America. They also knew how talented she was, though Keiko had always been modest about her abilities. "That's a wonderful idea," her mother said gently. "But are you sure you're ready? It might draw a lot of attention." "I think so," Keiko whispered, though her voice trembled slightly. The next few days felt like they lasted forever. Keiko rehearsed what she would say to Mrs. Henderson, practicing the words in English until they felt natural. She imagined herself at the piano, sharing the music that had been such an important part of her life in Japan. Finally, Friday afternoon arrived. As the other students rushed out of the music room, chattering about their weekend plans, Keiko lingered behind. Her palms were sweaty and her heart was pounding so hard she was sure Mrs. Henderson could hear it. "Mrs. Henderson," she called softly. The teacher looked up from her desk where she was grading papers. "Yes, Keiko?" "You should hurry or you'll miss your bus." Taking a deep breath, Keiko stepped forward. "I was wondering about the talent show. I would like to try out." Mrs. Henderson set down her red pen and really looked at Keiko for the first time in weeks. She saw a small, quiet girl who barely spoke in class, who seemed to struggle with confidence, who often looked confused during their music lessons. "Oh," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone already skeptical. "What would you want to perform?" "Piano," Keiko said, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Piano? Keiko, that's quite ambitious." "Piano is one of the most challenging instruments, and we only have room for our very best performers in the showcase." "I know. But I have been playing for a long time, and How long is a long time?" Mrs. Henderson interrupted, standing up from her desk. "Since I was 4 years old," Keiko replied, her confidence growing slightly. But instead of being impressed, Mrs. Henderson looked even more doubtful. She walked around her desk and stood in front of Keiko, looking down at the girl's small hands. "Keiko, I understand that you want to be involved, and that's admirable. But piano requires years of serious training, proper technique, and a lot of natural ability. It's not something you can just pick up as a hobby." Other students had begun to gather near the doorway, drawn by the unusual sound of Mrs. Henderson's raised voice. They sensed drama and crowded closer to listen. "I do have training," Keiko said, her voice getting smaller as she noticed the audience forming behind her. "My grandmother, she taught me, and I had lessons in Japan with—" "Oh, Keiko," Mrs. Henderson said with a laugh that wasn't entirely kind. "I'm sure your grandmother was a lovely woman, but what we're talking about here is serious professional-level performance. This talent show represents our school, and we need to make sure we put our best foot forward." The students by the door were whispering now, and Keiko could feel their eyes on her. Her cheeks began to burn with embarrassment, but she pressed on. "Please, Mrs. Henderson, could I just show you? I could play something small just to—" "Keiko, look at yourself," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice growing louder and more impatient. She gestured toward Keiko's small frame. "You can barely reach the pedals on our piano. Your hands are tiny. Piano isn't for everyone, dear. Some people are natural performers and others—" She paused, looking Keiko up and down. "Others are better suited for different things." The words hit Keiko like a slap across the face. She felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she blinked them back desperately. She couldn't cry here, not in front of all these students who were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity. "But I really can play," she whispered, one last attempt to make Mrs. Henderson understand. "I'm sure you think you can, sweetheart. But there's a big difference between playing chopsticks at home and performing Beethoven on stage. You need to focus on fitting in here first before you try to stand out. Maybe you could help backstage instead? We always need people to move props and help with costumes." The suggestion felt like the final blow. Keiko stood there for a moment, surrounded by the whispers and stares of her classmates, feeling smaller than she had ever felt in her life. In Japan, she had been respected for her musical abilities. Teachers and other students had often asked her to play at school events. But here, she was being dismissed without even being given a chance to prove herself. "Okay," she finally managed to say, her voice so quiet it was almost inaudible. "Good girl," Mrs. Henderson said, already turning back to her desk. "I know you understand. Now run along before you miss your bus." As Keiko walked toward the door, she had to push past the cluster of students who had witnessed her humiliation. She heard fragments of their whispered conversations as she passed. She thought she could play piano. That was so embarrassing. Mrs. Henderson was right, though. She's way too quiet and tiny. I felt kind of bad for her. Keiko kept walking, through the hallways that suddenly felt endless, past the lockers that seemed to tower over her, toward the buses that would take her home to the only place where she felt safe. That evening, when her parents asked about her day, Keiko simply said it was fine. She couldn't bear to tell them what had happened. Couldn't find the words to explain how her dream had been crushed before it even had a chance to grow. But late that night, after her parents had gone to bed, Keiko sat at the old upright piano in their living room and played softly in the darkness, her fingers moving across the keys like they were speaking a language only she understood. The old upright piano had arrived from Japan just 2 days after the moving truck delivered the rest of the Tanaka family's belongings. It wasn't much to look at. The dark wood had a few scratches from the long journey, and one of the keys stuck occasionally. But to Keiko, it was like greeting an old friend after months of separation. What none of her classmates or teachers knew was that this humble piano held the key to a world where Keiko felt confident, capable, and truly herself. Every day after school, while her parents were still at work, she would sit on the familiar bench and let her fingers find their way across the keys. The afternoon after her humiliation in Mrs. Henderson's classroom, Keiko came home feeling more defeated than ever. She dropped her backpack by the front door and walked straight to the piano without even stopping for her usual after-school snack. Her mother had left a note on the kitchen counter saying she would be late coming home from her new job at the accounting firm, and her father wouldn't return from the university where he was doing research until evening. Keiko was grateful for the solitude. She needed time to think, time to remember who she really was beneath all the confusion and embarrassment of trying to fit into American school life. She sat down at the piano bench and placed her hands gently on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, feeling the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips. Then, almost without conscious thought, she began to play. The melody that emerged was one her grandmother had taught her when she was 7 years old, a traditional Japanese piece called Sakura, or Cherry Blossoms. But Keiko didn't play it the simple way most children learned it. Her version was complex, filled with variations and embellishments that transformed the familiar tune into something both haunting and beautiful. As she played, memories flooded back. She remembered sitting beside her grandmother on a similar bench in the house in Osaka, her small hands trying to mirror the graceful movements of the older woman's fingers. Her grandmother, Oba-chan, had been a professional pianist in her youth, performing in concert halls across Japan before she married and started a family. Music is not about the notes on the page, Oba-chan had always told her. Music is about the story your heart wants to tell. After finishing Sakura, Keiko's fingers moved naturally into a Chopin etude, one of the most technically challenging pieces in classical piano literature. Her hands flew across the keys with precision and grace that would have impressed even advanced music students twice her age. The sound filled the small living room, each note crisp and clear, building to crescendos that seemed impossible for such small hands to produce. This was Keiko's secret world. In Japan, she had been recognized as a prodigy. From the time she was 6 years old, she had won regional competitions and performed in recitals attended by hundreds of people. Her teacher, Mr. Yamamoto, had trained students who went on to study at the most prestigious music conservatories in the world. Here in America, nobody knew any of this. Her parents had decided not to mention Keiko's musical achievements when they enrolled her at Lincoln Elementary. They wanted her to have a fresh start, to make friends based on who she was as a person rather than being seen only as the piano girl. They thought it would help her adjust to fit in more naturally. Now, as Keiko transitioned seamlessly from Chopin into a thunderous Rachmaninoff piece. She wondered if keeping her abilities secret had been a mistake. Mrs. Henderson's words echoed in her mind. Piano isn't for everyone, dear. If only the teacher could hear her now, could see the way her fingers moved with absolute confidence across the keys, never missing a note even in the most complex passages. The Rachmaninoff piece required her to reach across nearly the full span of the keyboard, her arms stretching as she played cascading runs that sounded like musical waterfalls. Her foot worked the pedals with precise timing, creating the rich, full sound that made the old piano sing with surprising beauty. As she played, Keiko felt her confidence returning. This was who she really was. Not the quiet, confused girl who struggled with English and felt embarrassed by her cultural differences. Here at the piano, she was powerful. She was skilled. She was somebody who mattered. She spent 2 hours that afternoon playing pieces that ranged from Bach's mathematical precision to Debussy's impressionistic dreaminess. Each composer spoke to a different part of her soul, and her hands seemed to understand exactly how to bring their visions to life. The next few days at school were difficult. Word had spread about her failed attempt to audition for the talent show, and Keiko could feel the pitying glances of her classmates. During lunch, she overheard a group of girls talking about their own plans for the showcase. "I'm going to sing that new pop song everyone likes," said one girl with blonde pigtails. "My mom is helping me with the dance routine," added another. "What about you, Lisa? Are you still planning to play violin?" "Of course. I've been taking lessons for 2 whole years. Mrs. Henderson says I'm very promising." 2 years. Keiko almost laughed but caught herself. Lisa was a nice girl who had always been friendly to her, and it wasn't Lisa's fault that she didn't know about Keiko's 8 years of intensive training. That evening, Keiko's parents arrived home to find her practicing a particularly challenging Bach invention. They stood in the doorway, listening with the same pride and amazement they had felt countless times before. Their daughter's talent never ceased to amaze them. "How was school today?" her mother asked when Keiko finished the piece. "It was okay," Keiko replied, not wanting to worry them with the details of her continuing struggles. Her father sat down beside her on the piano bench. "You know, sweetheart, your mother and I have been talking. Maybe it's time to find you a piano teacher here in America. You shouldn't go too long without proper lessons." "I don't need lessons, Papa," Keiko said quietly. "I just need to practice." "But you're so talented, Keiko. It would be a waste not to continue developing your skills." Keiko looked down at her hands. "Nobody here cares about piano. They think it's boring, or too hard, or not for people like me." Her parents exchanged worried glances. They were beginning to understand that their daughter's adjustment to American school was more difficult than they had realized. Over the following weeks, Keiko established a routine. She would come home each day, complete her homework as quickly as possible, and then spend hours at the piano. She played everything from memory, complex concertos, delicate sonatas, powerful etudes that pushed her technical abilities to their limits. Sometimes she played pieces that reflected her homesickness, slow and melancholy melodies that spoke of missing familiar places and people. Other times she played with fire and passion, pouring all her frustration and loneliness into thunderous climaxes that made the windows rattle. The piano became her diary. Her therapist and her best friend all rolled into one. Through music, she could express feelings that she couldn't put into words, especially not in her still imperfect English. Meanwhile, at school, Mrs. Henderson continued to plan the talent showcase. She worked with students who would sing popular songs, perform simple dances, or play basic pieces on various instruments. She never gave Keiko another thought, having dismissed her so completely from consideration. If she had walked past the Tanaka house on any afternoon and heard the music flowing from within, she might have stopped in amazement. She might have realized that sitting in her classroom every day was a student whose musical abilities far exceeded anything she had ever encountered in her 25 years of teaching. But Mrs. Henderson never walked down that particular street, and Keiko's secret remained safe, hidden away in the small living room where magic happened every day after school, witnessed only by family photographs and the afternoon sunlight streaming through lace curtains. The morning of the talent showcase arrived with an unusual buzz of excitement throughout Lincoln Elementary. Colorful posters decorated the hallways, and students who weren't performing spent their classes whispering about what they expected to see that evening. The school auditorium had been transformed with special lighting and a backdrop painted by the art club. Keiko walked through the halls feeling invisible, as she had for the past month. While other students excitedly discussed their performances, she carried her books and tried to blend into the background. She had convinced herself that she didn't care about the talent show anymore, that it didn't matter that she wasn't part of it, but deep down, a small part of her heart still ached when she heard her classmates talking about their acts. Mrs. Henderson spent the entire day in preparation mode, rushing between the auditorium and her classroom, clipboard in hand, checking and double-checking every detail. She had 12 student acts lined up, ranging from singing and dancing to magic tricks and instrumental solos. Everything was planned perfectly. At 3 o'clock, students who were helping backstage gathered in the auditorium for final preparations. Keiko was among them, wearing a simple black dress that her mother had chosen for the occasion. Her job was to help move props between acts and make sure the performers had everything they needed. Now remember, Mrs. Henderson announced to the group of backstage helpers, "This is a very important evening for our school. Parents, teachers, and even some school board members will be in the audience. Everything must go smoothly." Keiko nodded along with the other students, though she felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Being so close to the stage, surrounded by musical instruments and hearing the excited voices of the real performers, made her remember how much she had wanted to be part of this show. As the afternoon wore on, parents and families began arriving. Keiko watched through the side door as people filled the auditorium seats, cameras and phones ready to capture their children's moments in the spotlight. She spotted her own parents in the third row. They had come to support the school event, even though their daughter wasn't performing. The sight of them sitting there, looking slightly out of place but trying to smile and fit in, made Keiko's chest tighten with emotion. They had given up so much to move to America, and she knew they had hoped this new country would offer her opportunities to shine. Instead, she was hidden in the shadows, helping other children live their dreams. 30 minutes before showtime, disaster struck. Tommy Richardson, a 6th grader who was supposed to perform a guitar solo, burst into tears backstage. "I can't remember the song," he sobbed to Mrs. Henderson. "I keep messing up the chords. I'm going to embarrass myself in front of everyone." Mrs. Henderson knelt down beside him, her voice gentle but stressed. "It's going to be okay, Tommy. Just take deep breaths and—" "I can't do it," Tommy interrupted, shaking his head frantically. "I want to go home." Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, another crisis emerged. The microphone system, which had been working perfectly during the afternoon rehearsal, suddenly started producing an awful screeching sound whenever anyone spoke into it. The school's maintenance worker, Mr. Pete, was called in to investigate. "Looks like one of the main cables got damaged somehow," he announced after crawling around under the stage for 10 minutes. "I can try to fix it, but it's going to take at least an hour, maybe 2. Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. The show was supposed to start in 20 minutes, and parents were already seated in the auditorium, expecting to see their children perform. Principal Williams appeared beside her, looking equally concerned. "What are our options?" he asked quietly. "Well, we could postpone the whole thing until next week," Mrs. Henderson said, though her voice revealed how much she hated that idea. "Or we could try to do some acts without microphones, but half of our performers are singers who need amplification." As they talked, more problems seemed to pile up. The CD player that was supposed to provide background music for the dancers suddenly refused to work. One of the spotlights flickered and went out. It felt like everything that could go wrong was going wrong. The backstage area became chaotic as worried students gathered around Mrs. Henderson, asking what was happening and whether the show would still go on. Parents in the audience were starting to murmur among themselves, checking their watches and wondering about the delay. But Keiko stood off to the side, watching the adults try to solve problem after problem. She could see through the curtain that people in the audience were getting restless. Some families with young children were starting to look like they might leave. That's when she noticed the grand piano. It had been sitting on the far side of the stage, covered with a cloth and pushed into the corner. The school had owned it for years, but it was rarely used because most of the music classes were held in a separate room with an electric keyboard. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned once that it was old and probably out of tune, but it was still a piano. And unlike the broken microphone system, It didn't need electricity or cables or any technology that could fail. Keiko found herself walking toward it, almost without realizing what she was doing. She pulled back the cloth and lifted the lid, revealing keys that looked like they hadn't been played in months. She pressed one key gently, then another. The sound wasn't perfect, but it wasn't terrible either. "Mrs. Henderson," Keiko called softly. The teacher looked up from her heated discussion with Principal Williams and the maintenance worker. "Yes, Keiko? I'm sorry, but this really isn't a good time for the piano," Keiko interrupted, her voice barely audible above the backstage commotion. "Maybe someone could play the piano while you fix the other things. To keep the audience happy?" Mrs. Henderson glanced at the old piano, then back at Keiko with a look that clearly said she didn't have time for silly suggestions. "Oh, Keiko, that's sweet of you to think of, but none of our performers prepared piano pieces. And this isn't exactly background music time. People came to see a talent show, not listen to someone plunk around on an old piano." Principal Williams, however, looked more interested. "Actually, that's not a bad idea. If we could have some music playing while we sort this out, it might keep people from leaving. Do any of the students know how to play?" Mrs. Henderson looked around at the group of nervous performers and backstage helpers. "Well, Lisa knows a little violin, but that won't work without the microphone system. And Tommy plays guitar, but he's too upset to perform right now." "What about simple piano pieces?" Principal Williams asked. "Something calm and pleasant?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes swept over the students again, finally landing on Keiko. For a moment she looked like she was about to dismiss the idea entirely. Then she sighed, clearly desperate enough to try anything. "I suppose," she said slowly, "if someone could play a few easy songs, something everyone knows, it might help, but it would have to be very simple. Nothing fancy or complicated." Keiko felt her heart start to race. This was it, an unexpected opportunity, a chance that had appeared out of nowhere when everything else was falling apart. "I could try," she whispered, so quietly that Mrs. Henderson had to lean in to hear her. "You?" Mrs. Henderson looked surprised. "But Keiko, you said you wanted to play piano for the talent show, and I explained that it requires just to help," Keiko said quickly. "While you fix the microphones, something simple like you said." Mrs. Henderson hesitated, glancing between the old piano and the group of increasingly anxious parents visible through the curtain. Finally, desperation won over skepticism. "All right," she said with a resigned sigh, "but just play something everyone knows. Mary Had a Little Lamb or Twinkle, Twinkle. Little Star." "Nothing that will draw attention to itself." Keiko nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she walked to the piano bench and sat down. Behind the curtain, she could hear Principal Williams addressing the audience, explaining that they were experiencing some technical difficulties, but that the show would begin shortly. In the meantime, he announced, one of their students would provide some background music. Keiko placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, allowed herself to remember exactly who she really was. The auditorium fell quiet as Keiko's fingers touched the piano keys for the first time in front of an audience since leaving Japan. For a moment, she sat perfectly still, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on her small frame. Behind the curtain, Mrs. Henderson was whispering urgently with the maintenance worker, completely focused on fixing the microphone problems. Keiko had been asked to play something simple, something that wouldn't draw attention. She was supposed to provide quiet background music while the adults solved their technical difficulties. But as she sat there, something deep inside her began to stir. All the months of hiding, of being dismissed, of feeling invisible suddenly crystallized into a single moment of clarity. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Music is not about the notes on the page. Music is about the story your heart wants to tell." What story did her heart want to tell? Keiko's fingers began to move, but instead of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," the opening notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz flowed from the old piano. The sound was clean, precise, and surprisingly beautiful despite the instrument's age. The melody danced through the auditorium like spring water over stones, clear and sparkling. In the audience, conversations gradually stopped. Parents who had been checking their phones looked up. Children who had been fidgeting in their seats grew still. There was something magical happening on stage, something no one had expected from the quiet background music they had been promised. Mrs. Henderson, still crouched behind the sound equipment, heard the change in the room's atmosphere and glanced toward the stage. Her clipboard slipped from her hands as she saw Keiko's fingers flying across the keys with impossible speed and grace. This wasn't simple background music. This was virtuoso-level performance that belonged in concert halls, not elementary school auditoriums. As the Chopin piece reached its playful conclusion, Keiko seamlessly transitioned into something even more challenging, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. The dramatic, thunderous opening chords filled every corner of the auditorium with such power that some people gasped audibly. The old piano, which hadn't been played seriously in years, seemed to come alive under her touch. Keiko's small hands moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who had been trained by masters. Her posture was perfect, her technique flawless. Every note rang out with crystal clarity, building to crescendos that seemed impossible for someone her size to produce. The pedal work was sophisticated, creating layers of sound that most adult pianists would struggle to achieve. In the third row, Keiko's parents sat frozen in amazement and pride. They had heard her play countless times at home, but seeing her command an audience like this, watching 200 people fall completely under the spell of her music, filled them with emotions they could barely contain. Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she watched her daughter finally being seen for who she truly was. The Rachmaninoff piece demanded everything of a performer: technical precision, emotional depth, and physical strength. As Keiko played, her entire body moved with the music. She swayed during the gentle passages and attacked the powerful sections with an intensity that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul. This wasn't just playing music. This was storytelling of the highest order. Mrs. Henderson stood transfixed, her mouth slightly open in shock. She had dismissed this child as someone who needed to focus on fitting in first, someone whose small hands and quiet demeanor made her unsuitable for serious music. Now she was witnessing a performance that exceeded anything she had seen in her 25 years of teaching. As the dramatic piece built to its thunderous climax, every person in the auditorium was leaning forward in their seats. The music seemed to reach inside each listener and stir emotions they didn't know they had. Children who normally couldn't sit still for 5 minutes were completely absorbed. Adults who had come expecting simple school performances found themselves experiencing something that would stay with them forever.